All right, welcome back. Our final session of the day features one of the best-selling authors in the World War II field. She joined us for our 2021 International Conference, serving as the closing speaker, and came back for a Meet the Author shortly thereafter. Actually, no, it was during that dark time of COVID. That was a webinar. But Jeanette Conant is the author of 4 bestsellers: Tuxedo Park, A Wall Street Tycoon and the Secret Palace of Science That Changed the Course of World War II, 109 East Palace, Robert Oppenheimer and the Secret City of Los Alamos, The Irregulars, Roald Dahl and the British Spy Ring in Wartime Washington, and A Covert Affair, Julia Child and Paul Child in the OSS. Her biography of her grandfather, man of the hour, James B. Conant, warrior scientist, was a critical success and hailed as, quote, an outstanding portrait and, quote, magisterial. She has also published The Great Secret, the classified World War II disaster that launched the war on cancer, and her latest, Fierce Ambition, the life and legend of war correspondent Maggie Higgins, which we will hear about momentarily. A former journalist, Jenny has written for Vanity Fair, Esquire, GQ, Newsweek, and the New York Times. Interviewing Jeanette will be Dr. Steph Hennerschutz. Steph is an assistant professor of security and military studies at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. She received her PhD in history from the University of Maryland and specializes in civil military relations on the U.S. home front during World War II, particularly the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Her most recent book, Japanese American Incarceration, The Camps and Coerced Labor During World War II, was published in 2021. She was an invaluable member of the Jenny Craig Institute for 3 years, serving as senior historian until last summer when she took her current position at the Air Command and Staff College. For those of you who have walked through the new Liberation Pavilion, much of what you see, it's hard not to see Steph's 3 years of blood, sweat, and tears, and a lot of hours and a lot of content meetings as you walk through. And though we're sad she left, we are fortunate that she is still affiliated with the museum and the Institute by serving as a non-resident fellow. With that, it's my pleasure to turn the stage over to Steph Hennerschutz and Jeanette Conant. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for being here today, and happy Women's History Month. So we're kicking it off in a really great way. Thank you, Jeremy, for the introductions, and Connie for all of your hard work. And thank you, Jeanette, for being here today. I'm very excited to be interviewing you and to hear you talk a little bit more about your book. And it is about a topic that I don't know if many people know of Maggie Higgins. They should, if they don't. There's been some work, they will now, yes. There's been some work come out recently on women war correspondents during World War II, but I think it's a good opportunity to learn a little bit more about this woman in particular. And I want to start off by just asking you how you got interested in Maggie.
Well, thank you for having me back here. It's always a thrill to be at the World War II Museum. And it's funny because when you're here and you walk through these buildings and these halls and you see the array of famous faces, they are overwhelmingly male. And you've heard today about a lot of women and their very substantive contributions. But, you know, certain themes emerge. One, the WACs, the WAVES, the women in the Marines, the nurses, they are generally applauded for their group as their group effort. You don't know them by name, and few individuals emerged as well known. And that some of the women that were well known, as you heard earlier about Anna Rosenberg, chose to operate behind the scenes. They did not seek fame. So that when we talk about World War II and the greatest generation and the heroes that so many of us like to read about and look up to, they tend to be men. So after writing, 6 books about World War II and all of them about men, except for the one about Julia Child, who went on to great fame as a chef after the war, I thought, well, could I find a woman who made her name in World War II, in wartime, but didn't remain in the shadows? And very quickly, I arrived at Maggie Higgins, because Maggie Higgins actively sought the limelight. She did not just seek to become the best in her profession, the best war correspondent of her time. She did not want to be the best female war correspondent. She wanted to be the best war correspondent, full stop, sex undesignated. And this was an amazing fact, because this was at a time when newspapers still regarded female reporters as paper dolls. And that meant that the editors wanted to relegate them to fashion and society and women's issues. They certainly didn't want to send them overseas to war. So Maggie's ambition was absolutely incredible, and the odds against it were enormous. To give you an idea, Maggie won the Pulitzer Prize for combat reporting in 1951. It would be 30 years before another woman would win in that category. That's how far ahead of her time she was. So I sought out a woman that actively wanted the glory that was reserved for the guys. She wanted to be in the center of the action, and she wanted to be where the men were.
And we'll get into this more, I'm sure, but I think that is a key part of understanding Maggie's story, the fact that she did want to be in the spotlight, and she did want that, and how hard it is for women to want that and to not be taken the wrong way. So that's a really key factor about her personality. But I do also want to transition a little bit to talking about Maggie herself. Now, Marguerite Higgins strikes me as the type of person that she could have been whatever she wanted to have been. If she put her mind to it, whatever she wanted to be, she could have done that. But what was it about journalism? Why did she want to get into reporting?
Well, she was inspired, her love of war and wartime journalism was inspired by her father. Her father was a great-looking, great storytelling Irishman who had run off during World War I to be a volunteer ambulance driver, and then trained as a pilot with the famous French Lafayette Escadrille, a very legendary, storied unit of French war pilots. And he never got over the thrill of his wartime escapades. He came back with a French wife. He went overseas to Hong Kong to work for a shipping company, but he longed for overseas excitement and adventure. And when they settled in what she called their dreary suburban life in Oakland, her father was bored and he was unhappy, and he filled her head with his wartime adventures. And she was an only child, so she was a daddy's girl and the son he never had. So he turned her into an outstanding athlete. They hiked in the mountains. She could ride. She was a champion swimmer, a high school star athlete, and they read Hemingway's novels, his Dispatches from Spain, and she wanted nothing more than to sort of be a Hemingway-type character that her father would love and admire. She wanted to, as she said, if there was another conflict, she wanted to go and discover the force that cuts so deeply into the hearts of men.
When she decides that this is what she wants to do, that she really wants to get involved in journalism and reporting, this is, like you mentioned, a very male-dominated career.
Absolutely.
What were some of the challenges that she faced getting into the profession? And then once in it, what were some of the things that she continued to have to maneuver, and how did she do that?
Well, it was an extraordinarily tough time to become a journalist. She graduated from Berkeley, having studied journalism in 1941, and we're coming out of the Depression years, so there was massive unemployment. There were no journalism jobs to be had. So she went off to New York, as she famously would say later, with $7 in her pocket and nothing but her fierce ambition. And she got turned down for every job she applied to, and she was running out of money and desperate not to go back to dreary Oakland. And so she went to the Columbia Journalism School. She got a partial scholarship, and she quickly landed the job as the campus correspondent to the New York Herald Tribune. And once she got there, she was not going to leave. And the only reason she got to stay, quite honestly, was the draft was taking so many of the young male correspondents that, as her editor said, that he was desperate enough to hire a girl. But the newsroom, there was less than, there was maybe 3 women in the newsroom ahead of her, and they really covered women's issues. One of them famously covered Eleanor Roosevelt's press conferences, because Eleanor Roosevelt said only women could cover her press conferences. And so Maggie did not want to be that kind of reporter. She did not wanted to be relegated to the women's pages. She wanted to do what the men did. And if you worked for a city newspaper, a broadsheet like the New York Herald Tribune, that meant you covered the gore, the fires, the disasters, and that's where the action was. And it was deadline reporting, and you filed daily, and it was absolutely a man's world. And she immediately came up against the stark unfairness of it all. You know, the cops wouldn't talk to her. She wasn't allowed in most of the bars where the businessmen and the lawyers hung out that could give you scoops. You couldn't go to the Oak Room at the Plaza Hotel where the deals were cut because they said that you might interrupt with the deal making. And her real dream to be a foreign correspondent, that was out because the military barred women from covering combat, so you weren't even allowed near the front. So the absolute unfairness of the whole situation outraged her, and she decided that because it wasn't a level playing field, she wouldn't play fair. Now, what I've left out is that Maggie was gorgeous. She was a 5'8" blonde, and she decided that she would do whatever it took to get ahead. So she became extremely adept at using her looks to get past police cordons, to get past security, to get past guards at hospitals and interview people that nobody else could interview. And she started lining up scoop after scoop. And she got known for her incredible deviousness and her ingenuity and her ability to land interviews that nobody else could get. And that, combined with her language skills, got her overseas. But when she got there, she was frustrated because immediately she was told she couldn't cover any of the battles or any of the military action because war was no place for women. So she just had to keep pressing and fighting for every opportunity she could get. And in the end, she filled in for a male editor who was called away at the last minute and was sent into Germany behind lines to cover the bombing damage. And again, once she got there, she refused to be recalled. She would not go home. And she quickly discovered that the women were all relegated to pool reporting. They were shepherded by military minders in separate, segregated press camps, far from the action. They were pretty much fed the party line, and they were expected to travel together in groups and be shown the bombing damage in Nuremberg and Aachen and sort of write what they were told. Maggie did not want to do this because she was in a hurry to make her name. She was, as I said before, fiercely ambitious, and she wanted to be where the boys were, not where the women were. So she quickly discovered that one way to do that was to seduce a good-looking young officer with a Jeep. So she met a young reporter named Peter First, who worked for the Stars and Stripes, and convinced him that if they teamed up together, they could make headlines, and they did. She raced ahead of the 3rd Infantry Division, the 42nd, 45th Rainbow Divisions, that were rumored to be about to liberate Dachau. She and Peter First covered 20 miles of unsecured German territory ahead of the American forces, and were among the first to arrive at Dachau. And Maggie opened the gate, the infamous gate that said Arbeit macht frei, and walked into the prisoner compound and said in several languages, "Du bist frei," you are free. And the bedlam ensued in what Peter First would report in Stars and Stripes in one of the most heartrending and momentous liberation scenes of the war. And it made her famous overnight. So that inaugurated Maggie's style of war reporting, which was to break the rules and go where the women didn't go and make headlines wherever she went.
Yeah, there's a couple interesting things to pull on a little bit with that. Going back to the part about Maggie doing what she needed to do to be able to get ahead, it highlights this, it's still here today, but it was certainly then too, this double standard of when a man does something to get ahead, or when a man uses sex to do whatever it is that he wants to do, that's what he does. When Maggie used her looks, when she did what she needed to do to get access to whoever it was that she needed to be able to move forward, she was accused of sleeping her way to where she wanted to go. That was
Dancing on her back.
Yes.
That was a very common term that male reporters used to put down female reporters. Margaret Burke White, another infamous Maggie during World War II, got termed the general's mattress for the same reason. None of these were kind phrases, but to be a woman in the 1940s and to get anything done, to break away from the pack and to rise to the top of your profession, as Margaret Burke White did and as Maggie Higgins did, you had to break the rules because the rules said you didn't belong there. You had to be obstinate. You had to be manipulative. You had to be unreasonable. You had to be aggressive. And you had to be all things unfeminine. And you became labeled as difficult. So I wanted to do this book because I wanted to do a book about a gloriously difficult woman who tore down all of the barriers standing before women, blocking them from their dreams and from their ambitions. And Maggie, unlike most, was able to rise to the very top of her profession.
There's also, it comes up a number of times in the book, this inability for people to separate a young woman having fun and doing things that young women will do, just like young men, and equating that as this is how she advances in her career. And so, yeah.
Well, also, it was interesting because male correspondents, and for that matter, male officers in Europe for a long time in terrible circumstances, subsisting on poor food, drinking a lot, long nights, scary nights, all slept around. They had wives at home, but it was not seen as cheating. It was sort of seen as, just sort of how military men were abroad. The same went for male foreign correspondents. Women correspondents, however, were supposed to behave impeccably. Not to mention that for them, it was that much more frightening to be in a trench, to be in an isolated press forward camp being bombed or harassed by military fire. The fact that they might seek solace or comfort in a man's arms, God forbid. So it was interesting. The double standard was never starker than the behavior of the male officers and correspondents and the women in the forward areas.
What were, another little follow-up question to that, because we're talking a lot about Maggie's relationships with men in her field. What was her relationship like with other female correspondents?
Well, problematic, or not good. It was very amusing because, the women, as I said before, they really, they took them along on sort of Air Force junkets, on military junkets as they were called, and they traveled together. And they were expected to pool their Jeep and their sources, and Maggie did not want to do that. She was now some of these women, like Lee Miller, many of you have heard of her. She was a former model turned correspondent. She worked for Vogue. That was a monthly, was a woman's publication. You could file at your leisure. You had Martha Gellhorn that worked for Collier's. Again, she could file at her leisure. These were very different kinds of reporters than Maggie Higgins. Maggie Higgins was, at the front line of reporters, which is the breaking news, front page, broadsheet reporter for the New York Herald Tribune. Their direct competition was the New York Times. They lived and died to beat the New York Times. Not weekly, not monthly, but daily. You needed to have that headline ahead of them in the morning paper. And Maggie wanted to be first and foremost of that group, and that group was all men. And so she didn't want to tally with the women. She didn't want to be grouped with them. So she broke away from them in every way. Not only did she travel with men, and that meant using her charms to get a lift in the Jeep. The men liked to have her in the Jeep because when they ran out of gas, Maggie would go over to the military fueling stations and flash her smile seduce the sergeant there into refilling her Jeep before the military convoys. So she was useful to the Jeep driver as well. She knew how to get things done. But this did not endear her to her female colleagues. Not only that, but you heard a lot today about uniforms. Maggie didn't think much of the pencil skirt, and she took to wearing men's oversized fatigues, which she tightened with a belt. She wore a big German flyer's jacket and a Russian fleece, a helmet liner that disguised her blonde curls, so she looked like a man. And that wasn't done in those days. Her women colleagues thought very little of her comportment and her hygiene. She didn't look pretty. They didn't like the way she dressed. So she alienated a lot of women by breaking all of the rules. And she didn't care. She wasn't there to make friends, as she said. She was there to make headlines.
So a little bit of a loaded question, but considering Maggie's drive and what she wanted to do, would you say Maggie was a feminist?
You have to remember that feminism that we describe today, in the 1940s, one of Maggie's favorite writers was Rebecca West. And Rebecca West once said that she never quite knew what people meant by the label feminist, but it seemed to her that men only called her a feminist when she said something that differentiated her from a doormat or a prostitute. I think Maggie took the same view. Today, women identify themselves as feminists. I don't think Maggie did. Remember, Maggie did not want to be seen as a female war correspondent. She wanted to be seen as one of the best war correspondents. So she didn't like any of those labels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, her drive, reading your book, her drive gets her to the front lines. It gets her to where she is able to do the type of reporting that she wants to do. But it seems like, from what I took away from your book, once she reports on the camps and once she really gets in there, I saw a change from this very singular, I want to get there, I want my headlines, to it seems like she starts to grow a little bit about what her purpose is for reporting, what's her bigger goal. So I see almost like a little bit of a character development there, where she becomes a little bit more, I guess, worldly, or has a little bit more of a purpose for her reporting besides just her own advancement.
Absolutely. She's 24 when she starts covering World War II. She's a baby. And one reason she makes so much headway in a short time and becomes so well known is she was so young and athletic. And an awful lot of the World War II reporters were older, and they were tired. They had been reporting the war for years. Many of them were sick and burnt out. And Maggie arrives in 44 full of energy, and by the spring of 45, as Germany is falling, she is just working around the clock, and she is, covering battles with Colonel Michaelis, and she is under fire and reporting daily in harm's way, and she is making huge headlines as Germany falls. And she was so brutally ambitious that she just worked around the clock and put herself in harm's way all the time, because she wanted to become famous. She wanted to make her name. When she goes into Buchenwald, you have to remember that Buchenwald was the first major concentration camp to be liberated. Until then, really what the troops and even the reporters knew were rumors. As Andy Rooney said, they'd heard horror stories, but they just didn't know if they were true. And when they walk into Buchenwald and they see that human carnage, the full horror of the concentration camps, with bodies stacked like cordwood outside buildings, and men, women, and children literally dying in the barracks before them because they are literally taking their last breath. That degree of human misery, the scale of that tragedy is so overwhelming, and the moral responsibility to report that for the first time, you will be informing the world of that kind of tragedy and war crime. It fell very heavily on very young shoulders, and she came away from that experience with a new sense of mission. before she had been fueled entirely by her ambition, by the desire to be a war correspondent, to prove that a woman could do it as well as a man, to be allowed to stay and do that job. Once she started covering the concentration camps, she had a great sense of the terrible war crimes that had been committed, that demagogues like Hitler had to be stopped, that this kind of tragedy could never happen again, and it was a reporter's responsibility to expose it, to tell the world, and to warn the world about the dangers of fascism and totalitarianism. She became rabidly anti-fascist, anti-communist. She had a very deep sense of a calling that this was her mission from then on. So you did see a real change in the tone of her articles.
And then after the war, she goes on to cover the Nuremberg trials. Is that something that she is?
And that extended, the full, that was the Nuremberg trials, after the war, when all the Nazi war crimes were documented and really made public for the first time, the extent of the human and medical experimentation, the extent to which the Third Reich intended to exterminate people, literally. That changed everybody who was there in that courtroom.
So when the war's over and after she does her coverage of the trials, it's really, at least from, again, what I took away from this, is that she really makes a name for herself with her award-winning work in Korea, reporting on the Korean War. So am I right in that? Would you say that's?
Yes.
Okay.
She made her name. She came away from World War II as the New York Herald Tribune's celebrated girl war correspondent. She had seen all these German cities fall, and she was extremely well known. She covered the Berlin airlift, so she was a byline that was known to readers in America. And she also worked for the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's. She wrote for many of the magazines, so she was really a famous byline. And she was in Tokyo. Timing is everything. When the North Koreans poured over the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. South Korea was the last democratic outpost in Asia. And we as Americans were terrified that if we left this last democratic stronghold fall, the communists would take all of Asia. So we immediately rushed to South Korea's rescue. And Maggie was one of 4 reporters who managed to jump on an evacuation plane and head into Seoul as the city was being besieged by North Koreans and everybody was fleeing. She made her way to a small Korean military advisory group. There were 500 there that morning, but there were only 60 left when she got there. And they immediately told her that the city was surrounded and that she and the other reporters, her 3 colleagues, had to get out immediately. And they tried to cross, but the one river, the one way out of Seoul, the Han River Bridge had been exploded. And there was no way out, and they were facing death or capture. And the North Koreans were not known for capture. So after hours of trying to find a way across the river, there was nothing to do except the military commandeered rafts at gunpoint, and they crossed the river under steady gunfire from the enemy. She got separated from her military group at that point and from the other correspondents whose Jeep had been blown up. And she ended up hiking 14 miles alone with other refugees to safety in Suwon, wearing the same pencil skirt and flowered blouse that she'd been wearing at the Tokyo airport the morning before, carrying her 5-pound typewriter. She said later that it was a good thing she'd worn flats. I think after that, she didn't wear the skirt anymore. That's when she really moved to the fatigues full time. But she reported on the fall of Seoul. She was one of only 4 reporters and 60 officers to make it out alive, and that would really make her one of the most famous reporters in Korea. She was the only female reporter in the early months of that conflict. And what really made her famous was when the military decided that it didn't want any women there, and they ordered her out of the country. And they took her by army escort and put her on a plane out of Korea for Tokyo. She pleaded to be reinstated. The editors of the New York Herald Tribune wrote a famous editorial that ran in the paper about her bravery and how she was one of the first in, should not be forced out. And MacArthur, General MacArthur, had her reinstated. A famous telegram, "The Army holds Miss Higgins in the highest esteem." And she was sent back to Korea. And she would be, from that moment on, probably the most famous war correspondent in the world, because Edward R. Murrow is now doing radio programs and is older back at home. So she became incredibly famous.
And so this is it. Like, she's gotten what she wanted, right? This is her. Everyone knows who she is. Everyone knows Maggie Higgins, and she does a lot of tours, and she gets really celebrated. But how happy is she with this?
Well, journalism is a tough profession no matter what. It's a very tough profession to grow older in. It's relentless pressure, relentless deadlines. It's a very male profession still. But Maggie was a war correspondent, so she needed to chase conflict. So she won the Pulitzer for Korea, but she didn't settle back into civilian life well. What she did best was thrive in war zones. So she just kept going out and covering conflict in South America, in the Congo, wherever it was. So inevitably, she was drawn to Vietnam. And she started covering Vietnam in 1954, way before other reporters were covering it. She knew a lot about Asia. And she'd been born, ironically, in Hong Kong and had been to Vietnam as a baby. So she felt a certain romantic kinship, I think, with the country. And remember, she's come out of this experience of seeing the communist forces as the enemy. And so she felt very strongly that the Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese communists being backed with Russian and Chinese weapons, overpowering the young military officers, American troops that were in there as a sort of quiet police action, once again kind of mirroring Korea, were being overwhelmed by these better supplied, better trained communist forces. And she felt passionately that South Korea needed to be defended. So she immediately dedicated herself to covering Vietnam.
I like the way you put that with she needed to chase conflict. And if there's no war, what is she going to chase? And there's a big part in your book where you talk about her anti-communism stance, and she becomes very anti-communist. Does that make her seem a little bit too partisan sometimes with her reporting as she kind of goes through the 50s and the 60s?
Well, all these terms mean something else today than they mean then. I mean, remember that, for a long time people talked about objectivity in journalism, but in World War II, we were, as a country, very united against an implacable enemy. And the journalists worked very much in hand with the military. You traveled together. The military gave daily briefings. There wasn't the adversarial relationship that developed really at the end of Korea and then carried on into Vietnam and became very bitter between the military and the press. In World War II, it was much more collegial. It was much more a sense of a team effort. Certainly, reporters were aware that the military put a rosy spin on some of its press releases, but it was a team effort. So there wasn't the same sense of partisan. Going into Korea, that was certainly true in the first year or two of the Korean War. Again, reporters were patriotic. We wanted to protect our boys in the field. They were getting slaughtered in the first 6 months of the Korean War. When MacArthur's Incheon invasion was a success, which Maggie covered, that was a huge patriotic victory, and reporters were very swept up in that. The press really started to break away from the military in the latter days of the Korean War. It was going on and on and on. It was very expensive. It was very unpopular at home. American boys were dying in huge numbers, and people didn't see why. And the press became very critical of the war. and sort of broke from their longtime partnership with the military, and that would become much worse in Vietnam. But Maggie was old school. She married an Air Force general that she met during the Berlin airlift. She was very close to the World War II generals that she had covered that war with, like Michaelis, some of her closest friends. She was friends with Eisenhower. So she was old school and was more pro-military than the young reporters that covered Vietnam that were very critical of the military, and she was accused of being too partisan by the younger group, Halberstam and that group that came in and were very critical of the Vietnam War and very critical of the US military and very critical of President Kennedy and his covert war in Vietnam. And Maggie was Irish Catholic, and she became very close to the Kennedys. She covered Vietnam with presidential credentials. She was one of Kennedy's advisors, so she was seen as partisan.
Yeah, well, her relationship with Kennedy is very close, and there's a lot of really great detail in your book about that. I guess kind of with the partisan claims, how did other reporters react to her relationship with Kennedy and how close she was?
Maggie was a massive diva by the 60s. She was very, very famous. She was a star Washington correspondent. She was a famous Washington hostess. She'd helped Kennedy get elected. Bobby Kennedy was the godfather to one of her children. She was really part of the Camelot scene. She was always at the White House. So she was widely resented by her colleagues because she wasn't a normal reporter anymore. She was a sort of a celebrity reporter, and we call them Bigfoots, or and they're resented by the rank and file.
Mm-hmm. And she does try to have a TV show.
Oh, she does.
Right?
Early days of television.
Yeah.
She was on What's My Line and Meet the Press, which was an all-male show in the beginning. She was one of the first frequent female contributors to Meet the Press, and so she was a real personality in the 50s and the 60s.
And moving on a little bit later, what does she do later on in her life? Where does she go with her experience, and how does she sort of develop as a journalist?
Well, she writes many, many memoirs because she was so celebrated and such a sort of unique phenomenon as a female war correspondent. She wrote a memoir of her time in World War II, and then a memoir of her time in Korea, and then she wrote News is a Singular Thing about being a female journalist, and she wrote book after book. She was very prolific, and they were all bestsellers. But as I said before, she couldn't settle to domestic life. She had 2 children, but she was always on the road. And Vietnam, gave her another war. So she made 10 trips to Vietnam. And remember, in those days, travel is not what it is today. It was incredibly arduous. If you went overseas to Vietnam, you generally went for 3 months. It was expensive, and she would stop off in Cambodia and in India and interview those heads of state on her way back. So these were extended trips, and she came down with every infection and kind of dysentery and amoebic disorder that you could. She was very worn down. She drove herself relentlessly, and she contracted leishmaniasis on her 10th trip to Vietnam. In 1965, it was a rare parasite. By the time they got her back to Washington, D.C., she had 105-degree fever. They tried to save her. They could not, and she died at the age of 45 in the first week of 1966. And the military gave her a huge funeral, and it was said at the time that even though she was vanquished by a disease, her colleagues viewed her as felled by a bullet, as surely any soldier was, and she was given the very rare honor for a civilian of being buried at Arlington Cemetery. So she was a very unique figure. And I just want to read to you the obituary that was written about her in the New York Times, which was her bitter, bitter competition. They said, "There was steel in Marguerite Higgins' character, but it was concealed in a feminine figure and the femininity always showed even when she was slogging through the mud of Korea in baggy pants and men's fatigues. Maggie Higgins got stories that other porters didn't get. She did it with a combination of masculine drive, feminine wiles, and professional pride. She had brass, and she had charm, and she used them to rise to the top of a profession that relegated women to the softy beats of cooking, clothes, and society. Maggie Higgins made it in a big way that any man would have been proud of, and she won the Pulitzer for combat reporting. That's high praise from the competition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about what you just read and her life, her World War II reporting, what would you say we should take away from your book and from her life in terms of her legacy for journalism, for World War II?
Maggie was known as a deadline reporter, and her fame really came from her drive, her resilience, her physical stamina, and her courage. Above all, her courage. And many of the colleagues accused her of being brave to the point of reckless. But the last four letters of the word courage are rage. And Maggie Higgins was angry at the incredible unfairness that she encountered that made it so difficult for her to do her job and so difficult for her to get the stories that she wanted to get. And she was forced to go to extremes, to extreme behavior, to extreme measures, to extreme daring. And I think her legacy is that she not only overcame the obstacles that faced her, she tore them down. You know, as Mary Louise Kelly of NPR said when she interviewed me about this book, she knocked down the doors that were closed to women and paved the way for the next generation. Today, there are as many women covering global conflict as there are men, and they owe a large debt to Maggie Higgins.
Certainly. And thank you so much for presenting and talking about your work, and everyone should definitely go read the book and continue to learn more about Maggie. So I want to thank you, Jeanette, before we turn it over to the audience for Q&A.
Please raise your hand, and I will come around with the microphone. Questions? We have one in the center.
Do you think she would have ever mentioned that she thought she made any mistakes, did something wrong? Because it sounds like she was flawless.
Oh, no. Oh, good Lord.
She's self-critical. What do you think she would have said? Oh, I shouldn't have done this. I regret that.
She was very self-critical. One of the fun things about her are all the memoirs, because she was so young when she started, and she became so famous, so she made a lot of mistakes. And I think probably most of her mistakes came in the area of sex. You know, as a young girl, she had no mentors. There were really no women in the newsroom to mentor her. And she was very beautiful. And she was so ambitious and in such a hurry to get sent overseas. You know, the war was running out, and she was desperately afraid she would miss it. So I think in her hurry and her haste and her determination to make her name, you know, she was very brazen. And she stepped on people. She slept with men that she discarded quickly. She got a reputation that in those days, you know, was not favorable in the newsroom. And she made a lot of mistakes. I guess she kept moving up the ladder so quickly, she was able to sort of, you know, have the bridges she burned light her way, as the saying goes. But she was the first to admit that she made mistakes. And in her memoir, she, maybe not as bluntly as I just put it, but she does reference that she made mistakes and that she didn't always get it right. And she was very infamous. One of the fun things about the book is how infamous she was. And to give you an example of that, a colleague, a female colleague who really obviously did not like her, wrote a roman à clef about her before Maggie was 30. And the title of the book was Shriek with Pleasure, The Frenzied Tales of a Foreign Correspondent. No.
Next question's in the front center.
What was her call to journalism? Like, you've mentioned her looks a lot. If she was interested in being famous and she was attractive, why would she pick journalism if it was such an uphill battle for her?
Well, I think it came from her father. They read Hemingway's dispatches together. She read all of Hemingway's novels. She wanted to do what her father did, but women, didn't fight at the front, so she couldn't be a soldier. So she thought the next best thing would be a war correspondent, and she wanted to be right there on the front lines like Hemingway, and recording it and sending her dispatches back home. She did everything she did and wrote every story she wrote to impress her dad. Her dad, by the way, promptly re-enlisted when World War II broke out, and he had a very distinguished career in the OSS in his second war. So it was just a military family, and she did, as she wrote, when her father died, she was in Asia, and she couldn't make it back. And she wrote a very tearful letter to her editor saying that I did it all for Dad. So.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. I will come bring the microphone over. We have another in the front. Here you go, ma'am.
She handed it to me.
We have time for both.
I'm interested in her personal life. You mentioned that she had a son. So what legacy did she leave personally?
Her personal life was messy. She had an affair with the top military intelligence officer in Berlin during the Berlin airlift, General Evans Hall, and she got into trouble for it because he was married with 3 children stateside, and that wasn't done. So she ended up getting pulled out of Berlin at the end of the airlift. But in the end, he divorced his wife and married Maggie, and they became a very prominent Washington couple and had 2 children. I think it was a stormy marriage, as many post-war marriages were. I mean, people drank like fish during the war and then in the 50s. So, but she had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The son is a brilliant AI programmer in California, and the daughter, who looks very much like her mother, worked as a journalist for many years. But they never knew their mother. They were toddlers when she died. So.
And we will stay in the front.
You talked about her relationship with her dad. What was her relationship with her mom like?
Difficult. Close at the end. Her mother was French and had experienced, a very difficult life in occupied France, and then immediately after the war, and then she came to this country as a war bride, and she wanted her daughter to be the very best at everything. She was a very stern taskmistress and a very tough mother. And she became a French teacher in a very posh private school in Oakland for the richest girls in the area. And Maggie got a full scholarship, even though she was poor, because her mother was a French teacher there. So Maggie was pretty resentful about that because she grew up with a big chip on her shoulder of having been the poor scholarship girl at this very fancy private school, and knowing all the time that if she didn't get all A's, she might lose her scholarship. So she got all A's. She was the star athlete. She was the captain of every sports team. But she resented her mother for being such a tough and stern figure. So she was very close to her father, who doted on her. So.
Any questions?
Are there any other
Please raise your
questions?
hand. Well, I will ask a question. So it seems that Maggie left this world very young, but she made a huge impact before she did. So would you say, or what do you think she would feel, how would she feel about the impact that she's made and the changes that are in journalism today, and how you mentioned that there are just as many women in the field as there are men in this global reporting? Do you think she is aware of the legacy she left behind, aware of the change? How do you think she would feel about the state of journalism today?
Well, I think she would be glad that there are as many women covering conflict as there are today. Though I have to say, what amazed me in writing this book, and I think would dismay Maggie, is that I came up through journalism in the 80s and 90s. I worked for Newsweek and many of the monthly magazines, is that much of the sexism that Maggie encountered in the 40s is still with us for much longer than it should be. And I did an article for a magazine recently about the current generation of war correspondents. And I interviewed some of the most famous war correspondents working today, like Janine Giovanni, who writes for the New York Times and Vanity Fair and is known for her many books, and Jane Ferguson, who many of you know from PBS. And they all said that the challenges that they face covering conflict in the field pale compared to the sexism that they face at the Home Office. So we've come a very long way, but some of the difficulties that Maggie faced in the 1940s, unfortunately, are still with us. So we've got more work to do, ladies.
Jenny, I'm not going to ask you which is your favorite book. Is there a favorite dispatch of Maggie's? One that sticks with you?
Yeah, I think my favorite dispatch is when she went into Incheon, MacArthur's famous amphibious invasion in Korea, and it was the largest amphibious operation after Normandy, and she hit Red Beach with the fifth wave of Marines, and she wrote about being pinned under the seawall with the enemy rolling grenades down the seawall. They were pinned there for hours. And then she had to jump over the trenches and run across the unsecured beach. And Marines were falling left and right. She emerged alive. And I think that particular dispatch, and then the witness testimony from the men that were there that's in the book is, you know, it's unforgettable.
Next question will be to your right.
Thank you. I have a question about Hemingway, and if Hemingway got her into this line of work, did they ever meet? Did they have a relationship, or did they know each other? And how did she feel about him after she got to know him, if that happened?
There's a hilarious scene in the book when she meets Hemingway at the Scribe Hotel in Paris, and she's initially thrilled to death. Of course, he's quite rotund, and he's got a big snowy beard, so she says he looks like Santa Claus. And they're all drinking like fish in the basement of the Scribe Hotel, and she's completely struck by the glamour of being with all of these, as she put it, you know, world-weary war correspondents, and she recognizes the faces of some other war correspondents, and there are wounded correspondents, and Maggie wanted nothing more than to be wounded in battle, so she's sort of starstruck, and then the more she listens to Hemingway, the less impressed she is, and she comes away thinking that he's sort of got a very self-inflated opinion of him. She has a much lower opinion over time, because Hemingway was famously married to Martha Gellhorn, but he shacked up at the Ritz a few blocks away with another war correspondent, and really enraged Gellhorn, not just by cheating on her with another war correspondent, but he screwed her out of the big Normandy assignment by convincing her editors at Collier to send him to Normandy, not Gellhorn. And so Gellhorn was so mad that she smuggled herself on a hospital ship to be able to cover Normandy, and the military, because she did that and was not allowed to do that, stripped her of her accreditation, and she had to spend the rest of the war covering it from the sidelines. So I think that Maggie took a pretty dim view of Hemingway.
Sorry for dominating Q&A, but you just piqued my interest. Were there any contemporaries she admired or tried to mimic or follow their careers? Was she with Gellhorn?
Well, she became very good friends with Margaret Burke White, who she met in the press camps during World War II. And Burke White was, you know, a decade older than her and very famous. And she really, I think, she read Burke White's book about the Italian campaign, She studied her prose. She was fascinated by the fact that Burke White, dressed in quite sort of manly clothes, but always looked quite elegant, and didn't care about what people said about her, went her own way, and was the most famous female photojournalist, which is something that Maggie very much admired. And Maggie would take several pages out of Burke's book. One of the things that made Burke White famous was her trip to Russia, and Maggie would make a famous trip behind the Iron Curtain, one of the first reporters to do so. So she really emulated Burke White, and I think in terms of women of her time, that was the woman she admired the most.
Question. So you've mentioned a few times that she's been in the heat of battle and been in these really crazy situations. How in the world has she not gotten hurt?
Oh, she did get hurt. It's amazing that she didn't get shot, particularly at Incheon, but also she was in several hair-raising battles with Michaelis's division, the Wolfhounds during World War II. They were surrounded, that's during Korea, but she was in several horrendous battles in World War II and in Korea, and it's kind of amazing that she emerged without being shot. She got very banged up in a very serious Jeep accident at one point. She got sick a lot because, when you're traveling that way with very poor rations, and she slept in every kind of trench and hut. She was constantly infested with lice and had terrible dysentery, and she would come home having lost a massive amount of weight and take months and months of treatment to get rid of these amoebic infections. So, she really got run down, and I think it's probably contributed to her early death. But she wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. She was a very driven character. But not getting killed, I think that was luck,
Okay, if we have no other questions, a round of applause for Jeanette and Steph.
Thank you very much, ladies. What a wonderful conclusion to what I think has been a very rich and important day. We are delighted to have all of you here with us. We are delighted that all of our speakers came down to share their time and their talents. And before we break up and let Jenny and Steph go to the book signing table, I couldn't help but think of, I mentioned my grandmother at the start of the program. When I came here 23 years ago, I got a multitude of adoptive grandmothers, two of them in particular, Jeanette Solomon and Frances Hoffman, who were both amongst the first women Marines to join. They could not have been any different from one another in personality. Jeanette cursed like a Marine, and Frances was sweet and demure, but they shared a love of country, a pride in their service in World War II. They shared many stories with me. They shared a love for this institution, and they looked after me. So I want to give a posthumous shout out. They're not here with us anymore, but I kind of feel like they were with me today, to Jeanette and Frances. We have a book signing. We also have upcoming events I want to encourage all of you here to keep track of on our calendar. Those watching at home, please do the same. We will have a one-day symposium similar in setting to this for the 80th anniversary of D-Day in June. That'll be a part of all of the museum's 80th anniversary of D-Day commemorations. But to close out this day, I'd like to thank all of the speakers. I'd like to thank all of you for your wonderful questions, and a round of applause for Jeanette Conant and Steph Hennerschitz and all of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.